Rethinking HIV. Collective Fallacy, by Stefan Lanka. Continuum. September/October 1996. It is a dire example of how a distinguished scholar who has contributed much to the advancement of science, now impedes further progress by his stubborn adherence to a dogma of his own creation. If he did not feel himself obliged to repeat things that are untrue, just because they were once said, they would have become quite different people. Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, Maximen und Reflexionen, Textile 586. Readers will be aware that there have been a number of claims for, and responses to, Continuum's offer of a reward for the missing virus. These have ranged from requests for clarification as to the type of proof required, through dismissive comments that the proof sought was an irrelevance, to an outright claim to the prize by Professor Peter Duesberg. Readers will recall that the point of the whole exercise was consistent with my article explaining that HIV does not actually exist, as opposed to the more frequently asked question whether HIV is responsible for AIDS or not. The distinguished Australians led by Dr. Iliopoulos Papadopoulos have already provided a detailed reply to the Duesberg claim, so I shall endeavor to explain how the erroneous concept of retroviruses brought about the present situation. Duesberg's enormous services to mankind are beyond dispute. It is he who for nearly 10 years now, has steadfastly and at great personal cost, been the anchor of sanity and decency in a world driven mad by the simple-minded HIV theory. Whether HIV exists, and whether it causes AIDS is largely academic. When did you last come across a normal heterosexual, someone who does not derive his living from perpetuating the panic, who takes the slightest notice personally of the official story? In practice, Duesberg's claim to our unqualified gratitude has been his long-standing and unwavering opposition to ASD and its analogues, whose use always ends in death. That said, it is unfortunately also true that Duesberg is himself the victim of another collective fallacy, the Den Collective of Ludwig Fleck, which he himself helped to formulate and which he is now apparently locked into. Retroviruses were postulated as being that species of microorganism which caused reverse transcription to occur, which, as a working hypothesis at the time in the early 1970s, was entirely reasonable. The mistake was to elevate the hypothesis to a dogma. Early gene detection techniques lent some credence to the existence of an entity that could be transmitted from one cell to another, which was unfortunate, because this too turned out to be wrong. Errors of this kind occur whenever technology makes available for general use a new experimental procedure, which propels a whole army of researchers into mass-producing experimental data, heedless of what the biological significance, if any, of their work might be. Even worse is the habit of making countless ad hoc adjustments to the original theory, which completely distort the original hypothesis. Correct science demands that there should be a radical rethink when this happens. If there isn't, as in this case, a fundamentally flawed concept goes haywire, ending in disaster. Duesberg went along with mainstream AIDS researchers, limiting his objections to the relatively minor aspect of whether HIV could cause AIDS or not, whereas he really ought to have smelt a rat regarding the whole concept of retroviruses, given his earlier, courageous stance in admitting the mistaken role of retroviruses in causing cancer long before anyone else did, even though he was deeply enmeshed for a long time in that fallacy too. In my view, he could reasonably have been expected to satisfy himself that there was in fact no such an entity as a retrovirus at all. Instead, he has allowed himself to be bedazzled by the technical feat of retrovirologists who manage to reproduce in a consistent manner certain phenomena peculiar to particular biological constituents of cells. In so doing, he allowed himself to be misled into believing that this was due to a virus. It is a complete non sequitur. This lack of intellectual rigor has, in a contemporary metaphor, debased molecular biology to a virtual science, leading to the deplorable state of having a disease, AIDS, with a virtual definition, due to a virtual pathogen, HIV. Unfortunately for humanity, AIDS is not unique in this regard, but represents merely the tip of a much larger iceberg. To the astute observer, it should have been apparent as early as 1973 that the working hypothesis of ascribing the experimentally observed phenomenon of reverse transcription to retroviruses had become untenable. When it became known that reverse transcription was anything but rare by 1980 at the latest, the hypothesis should have been abandoned by everyone. Indeed, the extraordinarily artificial and circumscribed conditions under which reverse transcription could be induced in a laboratory should have alerted everyone to the extreme improbability of such exclusively laboratory conditions having any bearing whatsoever on naturally occurring phenomena. All the more so, as no retrovirus was ever shown to exist, for example, by being able to isolate and characterize it, and to demonstrate its transmissibility. These failures, obviously not for want of trying, should have sufficed to kill off the whole concept. It may be hard to believe that all maps purporting to represent a whole retrovirus, including HIV, are always compilations, many bits and pieces cobbled together by their authors to the best of their beliefs.